Excellent. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Jamie Trammell. I'm from Southern Oregon University, and we're really excited to have this conversation around a new dialogue draft that we've generated around this ever emerging and increasingly important topic around data centers and water use. Um, we have the draft memo that's been pushed out, and we are looking for comments actively for the next about 11 days. And our goal is to really, provide some ideas, not necessarily recommendations, but ideas and some things to consider for the Data Center Advisory Committee that the governor convened this year. Peter will give an intro to the service here in a minute, but just as a brief agenda, we're going to hear from all of us on the team. We're going to welcome some panelists, and we're going to walk through kind of the overview of our draft, welcome the panelists, kind of a little bit of Q&A with our distinguished guests, and then open it up to some broader questions, I believe. With that, I'll turn it over and we'll go ahead and get started.
How's my screen looking, Jamie?
Looks great. I can
Yeah.
see it.
Great.
Yeah.
We all set, Jamie?
Yeah.
Well, hello and welcome again. I'm Peter Maille from Eastern Oregon University, and we're discussing the Oregon Water Policy and Innovation Service and its second analysis, exploring how data centers use water and some of the options states are considering around data centers and how data centers fit within some of the existing Oregon policies for managing water. The full report and a summary for decision makers can be found on the service's website. These are initial findings, not recommendations, and we're certainly welcoming feedback. Next. The Oregon Water Policy and Innovation Service is a joint project of Portland State University, Eastern Oregon University, Oregon State University, and Southern Oregon University to provide objective third-party analysis of Oregon's toughest water policy challenges. Okay. The service responds to asks from two or more water leaders who share a concern for the same water problem but see policy differently. In this case, the service was asked by the Governor's Data Center Advisory Committee, which includes a diversity of perspectives around data centers, to look at number one, data centers conceptually. This framework includes a discussion of water inputs to data centers, both directly for cooling and indirectly via their sources of energy, water outputs via industrial wastewater, and community water use benefits via investments in things like water supply, infrastructure, other actions that benefit the communities where the data centers are located. And two, policy options for managing data center water, gathered from similar state and local policies used for data centers and other large-scale industrial users. There are anywhere from 123 to 136 data centers currently operational in Oregon, depending on the source. Oregon data centers have 37 different operators, and Amazon Web Services operates 47 facilities. The Google facility in the Dalles is the largest at 80 megawatts and 290,000 square feet. Most of the data centers are located in Portland metro area, with other concentrations in Boardman, Umatilla, Hermiston, and Prineville areas. Okay, go ahead, Trevor.
Thanks, Peter. Next down. So, as probably a lot of you know, data centers are not all the same, and some key differences affect their water footprint, including the size of the data center, which is often defined as, the number of servers that are installed, or its square footage, or its power capacity, as Peter just mentioned. Most of the on-site water at a data center is used to keep the facility cool, because rows of server racks produce large amounts of heat, and I heard a comparison recently. Data centers are like toasters. Most of the electrical energy supplied to a data center is directly converted to heat. So the number of servers, how efficiently they run, and when they are used throughout the year and time of day are all key determinants of how much on-site water data centers consume. And of course, the type of cooling technology installed and how efficiently that runs is also very important. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Data centers largely use potable water to cool the servers, as I said, within their facilities. Some data centers in other states are recycling wastewater from nearby treatment plants. So as I mentioned, the type of cooling technology significantly influences the on-site water footprint. Data centers can use water-cooled chillers that require large evaporative cooling towers, like the image you see here of the Google data center campus in the Dalles. This type of cooling consumes large amounts of water as it evaporates away to the atmosphere. So we call this open loop. But this system happens to be more energy efficient than the other popular cooling technology that uses air-cooled chillers. So this is an example of a large group of air-cooled units on top of a data center in Hillsboro, Oregon. These use much less water overall, but are more energy intensive. The air-cooled systems are essentially large fans that release heat from the facility to the atmosphere, much like a home or even a refrigerator, and we call this closed loop. So data centers can use a combination of several different types of cooling technologies, depending on the climate where they're sited and the time of year. So let's look at an example that illustrates just how different water use can be among large data centers. The on-site water use of a 4.6 million square foot data center campus with 11 buildings in the Central Oregon community of Prineville consumed about 70 million gallons of water in 2024. In the same year, 361 million gallons was consumed in the Dalles, just a short 2-hour drive away. The Dalles data center campus is much smaller, roughly 1 million square feet across 6 buildings. So Prineville's climate allows for outside air to be used to cool the facility for a large part of the year. And in the summer, they can use a system where hot and dry air passes through a series of wet filters that cool the air down as heat is released through evaporation. So this is called direct evaporative cooling. And in theory, works similar to the large cooling towers in the Dalles, but the Prineville system uses much less water because the evaporation is more of a supplement rather than the primary workhorse for cooling throughout the year. If you've ever heard of a swamp cooler in the Southwest United States, it's kind of a similar process, just at a massive scale. So this is just a glimpse into how geography and cooling technology type can influence water use. And these numbers are from a assumed evaporation rate from Meta Sustainability Report and from Google's environmental report for 2025. So using the water consumption numbers we used or we just saw, we compared 361 million gallons a year to about what 380 acres of alfalfa consumes to evapotranspiration in the same year, and 70 million gallons is roughly 74 acres of alfalfa. These numbers are derived from evapotranspiration estimates from the OpenET site, with alfalfa being situated in Central Oregon. For homes, taking the water use estimates from Prineville's master plan, if we convert the water use of data centers to the number of homes, we get about just over 2,000 homes for 361 million gallons a year and just around 420 homes for 70 million gallons a year. So hopefully that can give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about. And as I mentioned earlier, the on-site trade-off between energy savings and water savings. That discussion becomes much more complicated when we consider the following graph here on the screen. The most significant part of the water footprint from data centers is tied to their sources of energy, or the off-site water use. Energy generated from hydropower, coal, and gas-fired power plants and other sources consumes large amounts of water. And in 2023, it is estimated power generation for data center electricity demand in particular consumed 211 billion gallons of water nationwide based on regional energy mixes. Alternatively, direct on-site water consumption for cooling in 2023 is estimated to be 17 billion gallons, or only 8% of the total indirect and direct water consumption footprint. So the numbers we just talked about in the Dalles and Prineville would fit into that blue bar there on the right side. So now I'll pass it on to Alison to discuss some of the policy options and considerations we came across.
Thanks, Trevor. So the memo highlights 9 options or considerations for data centers and water use. And for Oregon, there were really 3 of those that our team thought deserved the most debate and discussion. And these are the places where we could use the most feedback on the memo. So the first is siting considerations. Some cities and watersheds have enough water to support data center growth, but others don't. So cities that have unused water rights are required to have plans, but not all those plans are current. Not all cities have capacity to get those plans updated, and not all watersheds have updated information about water availability or the amount of water needed to keep ecosystems healthy. A good national policy example is Minnesota HF 16, which requires both interagency coordination on data center permitting and review of water availability and impacts prior to construction of large data centers. Siting where there is enough water has to start with good information. Also, I think many of us know that the amount of water available on a water right doesn't always mean that wet water is actually flowing in a stream or available underground. Water availability information may be out of date, or in-stream water needs may not be fully defined. So this is another place where good, nuanced information is needed. The memo describes some questions that cities and states could ask as they update information on where water is available and where appropriate places might be for siting new large industrial water uses or users, including but not limited to data centers. Second, and similarly, most data centers are using water from public water systems and discharging wastewater to publicly operated treatment works, in other words, cities. So cities need the tools to ensure that their water systems can grow the capacity needed to serve data centers, and that data centers are paying for that infrastructure growth. Our research found several examples where Oregon cities and data centers are working together in innovative ways to improve infrastructure, not just for data centers, but for residents, farms, and the environment. In Hermiston, AWS data centers there have invested in aquifer storage and recovery and updated drinking water conveyance infrastructure with an $18 million investment. In a national example, if HF 2261 passes in Iowa, utilities would have the authority to assign different rate schedules for facilities using more than 20 megawatts of energy. The Oregon Public Utilities Commission just clarified similar authority for large electricity users in Oregon. Payne County, Oklahoma passed a resolution encouraging the state legislature to require performance bonds to cover the costs of decommissioning data centers if needed. So considering decommissioning could be important because if a data center starts off with an open loop evaporative cooling system, but then switches to a technology that uses much less water, or B, even worse, closes down, the city could be left with oversized infrastructure that's expensive to operate without that large industrial water user there. This is part of the issue that the city of Lakeview, Oregon is wrestling with after a biofuels facility there closed before it even came online and got to full operation. Third, data centers can provide an important economic development opportunity for communities. For example, data centers provide about $26 in tax revenue for every dollar in public service provided to those centers. But there are ways to ensure that community benefits are realized. Our research points to states that are setting expectations around community benefit agreements, and there's some examples of existing community benefit agreements here in Oregon. The Alliance for Great Lakes has produced a guide that includes some options for community benefit agreements with data centers and great case studies from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Detroit and Southeast Michigan, the Chicago metropolitan region in Illinois, and Ohio and Wisconsin urban areas. You'll hear a little bit more about some community benefit options in a moment from Emily, who's one of our panelists today. Finally, I want to touch on some existing Oregon policies. So Oregon has existing policies that apply to new water uses and wastewater discharges, both big and small. Some of these policies may be adequate to work with data centers in cities if they're applied. And then there are some gaps that Oregon might consider filling. Our memo points to some of these policies, but the three that I want to highlight here include one, the Oregon Water Resources Department requires cities with unused water rights to file and regularly update a water management and conservation plan. Several cities report their larger water users in these plans. So these plans can be vehicles for getting better information on large water users and overall trends in municipal water use. Second, Oregon's statewide land use planning system has a couple of goals, goals 9 and 11, which set expectations for enough land for economic development, that's goal 9, and ensuring there are public facilities needed to support development, well, that's goal 11. Public facilities includes wastewater and water infrastructure. And then finally, the third Oregon policy I wanted to highlight here, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality implements the Federal Clean Water Act, and that requires pollution discharge permits for municipal wastewater plants. These are NPDES permits and water pollution control facility permits where an industrial facility directly discharges wastewater. There are currently more requirements in NPDES permits than in water pollution control facility permits. So with that overview, I'm going to hand it over to Bobby.
Great. Thank you, Allison. Well, folks, that was just a quick overview of what we have in the draft memo. And as Allison just mentioned, and Jamie did at the outset, we have a draft out there, and we really do consider it a draft, and would really love to get feedback from you as you take a look at it. And we'll provide that out to everybody else in terms of an updated version. I just dropped the link to the Water Policy and Innovation Services website. You'll see a Google form on there for how you can give some feedback. But I think right now I'd like to kind of welcome in our panelists. So Trevor, if we stop sharing screen for right now. And we have Mary Ann Dickinson with the Lincoln Land Institute and Emily Washer with the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, joining us today a little bit to share some of the things that they're learning from data centers around the country, resources that they're developing that might be useful for us here in Oregon, and some of their perspectives from outside the state on things we should be paying attention to. So Emily, why don't I pass it to you first, just to give some opening remarks, and then Mary Ann to you. And Jan, thank you for the question in chat. If other folks have questions as they're hearing from people, go ahead and put those in chat, and we'll have a big Q&A afterwards. So Emily, I'll pass it to you first.
Okay, thanks, Bobby. Yes, hi everyone. My name is Emily Washer, and I am a water policy specialist at the Center for Water Policy. And essentially what we do at the center is conduct academic research on different water policy dilemmas and produce peer-reviewed articles for a variety of audiences, including academia or government decision makers and just the general public. So what I'm going to go into just very briefly later on is just sharing the research that we've been conducting for almost 2 years now on AI data centers and their water and energy demands. So thank you again for having me.
Thanks. And then Mary Ann, go ahead, and you had some prepared remarks. Mary Ann, why don't you go ahead and just say hi and who you are and just go right into that. And then Emily, I will circle back to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name's Mary Ann Dickinson. I am with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and I do have a few slides that I'd like to just sort of show you here. See if I can do the share, and hopefully this will come through. Everyone see that all right?
They look great.
Okay, so at the Lincoln Institute, we're not data center experts. We're people who work on land policy and the intersection between land and water policy. But data centers cropped up as probably the biggest significant divergent issue in planning where land and water are not adequately considered together. And now with energy, it's like a perfect trifecta. So we decided to take a look at what those issues might be for local communities. And the first thing we had to do, of course, was take a look at where data centers are active currently in the United States. There are, a little over 5,000 data centers of various sizes. You see, of course, Virginia is the biggest hotspot, what they call Silicon Alley in Northern Virginia. And they've been hosting data centers for a very long time, and their experience has been useful. But you see some hotspot areas, and there are some, of course, in Oregon as well. And so we wanted to take a look at those, but we also wanted to take a look at where new data centers were being proposed. There's talk about doubling data center capacity between now and 2030. And again, you've got proposals in Oregon, which and there are certain hotspots around the country. Arizona is a particular hotspot, which they have 109 data centers that are proposed there, which is kind of ironic considering that Arizona is a desert. So it's water is becoming a crisis issue in the siting of data centers, and we want to help communities make sure that they're addressing those issues correctly. So one of the first things we did was we partnered with the Environmental Law Institute to take a look at what ordinances and state requirements were being put in place in various states in the country. And again, you see Oregon as a state that has done a lot of advanced work in this area, so it's a clear leader. But you see these ordinances cropping up in places where there is a data center demand. Michigan is turning into a moratorium hotspot. 19 communities have voted moratoriums because they're panicked about what is happening with the proposals in their state. So we know it's clear that we need to provide some advanced advice to communities that might be getting data center applications so that they need to know what to do. So we came up with a list of what we thought communities needed. We want to make sure that each local authority, whether it's a municipality or a township or a regional district, that they have the proper local authority to make the right decisions, enforceable authority to make the right decisions. We need to make sure they have accurate analyses of what their local energy and water availability is. Energy tends to be more national grid-like, but water is local, and water availability is a very key consideration in the siting of data centers. Communities need strategies for avoiding energy and water rate shock. They need advice on taxation revenues and how many incentives should they be giving away in order to entice a data center that might actually cost them more than the revenue they're getting? What is the possible fiscal impact to a community? And then how should they negotiate community benefits? Yes, a data center will probably sign a community benefit agreement, but how should the community come up with what's in there, and what's the process recommendation that we would be making to them for how they can do that? And then finally, tools for addressing the financial risk of not only resource overconsumption, but potential abandonment and decommissioning. And I was interested to hear that you had an example of that already in Oregon. And we are very concerned about that decommissioning issue because that could end up leaving behind a facility. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that here. I had not realized this was even an issue until we started talking to scientists at the DOE, Federal Department of Energy, and Los Alamos National Lab. And I found that this whole abandonment issue was sort of becoming missing from the data center discussion, the general data center discussion. And I couldn't understand why this was even a possibility. Why would they walk away from $1 billion facility? And it all has to do with the rapid chip evolution. And if the chips are potentially obsolete within a 5 to 10 year period, even the racks on which the chips are stored can be, since they're geared to the chips, they also would be similarly obsolete. It might be cheaper for a company to walk away from a site rather than try to rehab it or reconvert it to newer, more dense and power dense and faster chips. So the cost is an issue, and if a facility is abandoned, and we have heard of a few examples around the country, we want to make sure that communities have risk instruments in place to reimburse them if it turns out that is happening. So what we're planning to publish, we're still working on all of this, and what we're planning to publish this year, and the first publication will come out hopefully sometime at the end of next month, is some geospatial mapping advice about how you map out what the resource issues are, our recommendations for the kind of zoning tools that communities could use, and they can adopt and modify as needed. Every ordinance should be bespoke to that community. It should never be a cookie cutter. It has to be very locally defined with local stakeholder input. But we also are designing strategies for avoiding especially water rate shock impacts. We know there's a way that can easily be done, and we're making recommendations about having data centers be wholesale water customers rather than industrial water users. If you're an industrial water user, any additional cost that comes from supplying you water is spread across the whole rate base. That's how there ended up being such, strong energy rate shocks. But if you make them separate customers with separate responsibility for covering all those costs, that does not affect the other ratepayers, and that's an important community protection. We want to give them a process for how to create good community benefit agreements that will be not only helpful in solving some of the issues at the local level, but making the data center a more welcome member of the community. And then lastly, in the fall, we'll be publishing actual case studies in Virginia and Arizona, two distinctly different hydrologies, but showing how to do a hydrological gap analysis and analyze whether a data center can be sited within your own watershed. So that's basically what we'll publish in 2026. And what can Oregon do? You've done some fabulous work already. It's very impressive what you've already put together. And in law, you already have some very detailed comprehensive plan requirements. And those plan requirements could be modified to include data centers very specifically. And it would require the local communities to do the kinds of assessments that you're basically needing to have them do. In your law already, a definition of data center already exists in statutes and administrative rules. And that comes from the taxation sections that address data centers and taxation. And perhaps that can be broadened to add evaluation of data centers into the comprehensive planning requirements so that you have a full-on approach to how communities should uniformly be looking at this issue. And I see you have an act that was passed last year, the Power Act, which seeks to hold energy users accountable for paying their own energy needs. It didn't specifically call out data centers in that legislation, but it's very specific and very clear. And it'd be useful to have something like that as well in water, especially if you're going to be making data centers wholesale water customers. They need to make sure that they carry the full weight of what their infrastructure costs and new supply costs are going to be. So we think that perhaps, even though the language of the law doesn't explicitly reference data centers in the Power Act, the background communications do, and maybe it might be a simple amendment to make that, abundantly clear. But you're on the right track. You're doing a lot of advanced analytics and work to give your communities the tools to do the job right. And I think that's the right approach. And so we'd be happy to help in whatever way we can.
Amazing, Marianne. Thank you so much.
And there's my email if anybody wants it. Yeah.
Perfect. And then, Marianne, for these images, you went through them pretty quick, and I know there's even way more depth behind them than that. Like if we wanted to send out to this group that's here today, those slides, is that okay?
Oh, in fact, you can send out the bigger deck that you saw me give that has more data in it. Sure, be happy to share that.
Nice. Feel free to drop out if there's already a hyperlink to that. Feel free to drop it into chat, and then if you want to send it to us, we can make sure it's
I'll send
available.
it to you. I don't think I have a hyperlink for it because, yeah, I just basically did it.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank
And
you.
I think that's one of the things that's really surprising us is even since we sent out our draft, there's been almost a webinar or conversation daily on this topic, and new resources are coming out all the time.
I have 3 this week.
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's just something for us here in Oregon to be mindful of is like there's a lot of learning to do, and there's going to be more information coming at us in like fire hose style. So, Emily, let's turn it over to you to share kind of your screen and give us a little bit about what your crew has been up to and kind of your thoughts of kind of what Oregon might be thinking about.
Yes, sounds good. Let's see. Okay. Uh, okay. Hopefully you all can see my screen. I'm just gonna put these all up there.
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. So kind of what I said earlier, the center has been conducting research on AI data centers, specifically their energy and water use for almost 2 years now. And when we started this research, we just started by looking into what the energy and water demands are of AI data centers. And then building upon that initial research, we found there is a huge lack of just transparency and potentially very large demands on electricity and water for a hosting community. So from that initial research, we next just started working on evaluating legislative responses to this emerging industry. And we had conducted a 50-state review of proposed and enacted legislation specifically affecting AI data center development. We're still, I created a tracker and everything because that is ongoing research. There's so much that happens every day and so many um, new updates at the legislative level, at the state level specifically. But essentially based on this 50-state legislation review, and just after receiving and responding to several external stakeholders' feedback, we developed a legislative model organized around 5 overarching legislative goals, which is what you see here on the screen. And our model is published, it's on our website. And I'm not able to stay for the whole Q&A, so I'm welcome to share, open to sharing my contact information, but you can also go on our website and contact us there if you have any more questions. But as you can see, these 5 goals reflect the key issues of public concern and capture the range of legislative responses that we've identified as currently emerging. And those are first being just to improve comprehensive planning. Although we conducted state level review of legislation, this first goal also includes a local piece, specifically enacting a moratorium, which we've seen happen more and more throughout the country at the local level. But we're also recommending that option to be done at the state level. Goal 2 is just to increase more transparency and public disclosure. The third goal is to protect local ratepayers from bearing increased utility costs. Fourth goal being to establish energy and water efficiency prerequisites for AI data centers as conditions for permit approval or just to become eligible for tax exemptions. Since so many states do have tax exemptions. And then the fifth goal is to just increase funding and create a funding mechanism that could potentially fund, some of the options that we provide under the previous 4 goals. And essentially, rather than mirroring a single state framework, this model draws on approaches from multiple states and, where appropriate, incorporates original draft provisions to address gaps that we identified and reflect emerging better practices. Oregon actually being one of those states from the Power Act, we pulled a lot of our inspiration from. And importantly, we are presenting here a menu of legislative options, and these options can be adopted individually or in combination. So while overall, the options we provide form a comprehensive legislative package, each option is also designed to function as a standalone response, depending on what a state's priorities are in the context of that specific state. So, although, like you can see here, our publication, it does say AI data centers. This work is grounded in the rapid growth of AI data centers, but much of this legislative responses that we have provided are intentionally structured so states can choose to apply them more broadly. So in other words, to all large water and electricity users, kind of what Mary Ann said with the definition of data centers and in the Power Act, just large energy customers or large energy users. And this is to just ensure that there's consistent treatment of high impact resource users across all sectors and kind of avoid the creation of AI specific carve outs where a broader approach may be more appropriate for that state. So yeah, this is essentially what we've been working on and this resource that we created to hopefully be helpful to states and local communities.
Nice. Thank you for that, Emily. Are you able to drop the hyperlink into chat for us?
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to do that.
Amazing. Thank you. And do you need to sign off? Or are you able to stick around for just a couple of minutes?
I can stay for a couple more minutes, yeah.
Okay. Well, if you're able to stay, I might both invite our speakers from the Water Policy Service in to join Mary Ann and Emily. And I'm looking at Matt Martinson's first question in chat. And Emily, you just mentioned this, right? There's a lot of worry about the hyperscale kind of AI centered data centers, but there's large there's large energy users, large water users in a bunch of different industries. So kind of have you looked for more kind of durable or universal policy frameworks that might be more agnostic to the particular type of industrial water use? And what have you thought about there? And then so I'll sit with that for just a second. I'll just remind us too, at least from the Water Policy Services perspective, our job is to provide options and not particular recommendations. Like we are totally fine saying Iowa did it this way, but farmers are going to hate you forever. And California did it this way, but environmental groups are going to sue you. Not saying good or bad, it's just stuff happens but people are doing it. So with that, I'll feel free to answer the question there.
Yeah, so I guess what we did essentially was just look at any laws that had been introduced or enacted that either specifically mentioned data centers, or if we couldn't find that, looking at just large electricity users or potentially large water users. I don't think, I guess we, to answer the question, looked at a specific industry of water users. I don't know if that answers your question or if I'm fully understanding it, but we were just looking specifically at water users or electricity users because AI data center facilities just use so much of both. So that's kind of where our research was more focused on.
Yeah, so I'm hearing you say it's really the total amount of energy or the total amount of water being used, regardless of what the industrial sector is kind of the more important thing to be looking at.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. How about you, Marianne?
In our work, we're not differentiating between the hyperscale centers and the smaller centers because the standards for how you make your siting decisions should be the same no matter what the scale. It has, as long as you have the resources to supply, that's the fundamental question, whether it's energy or whether it's water. And so we weren't looking at state legislation options. We were looking at local community options. And they will differ based on what your local enabling authorities are from state to state. But Oregon, you've got very strong comprehensive planning requirements at the local level. So it should be fairly easy to make sure data centers are considered as an appropriate use within the community and regulated in a way that the standards that might be put as conditions on the development, that they can be enforced by the community. We have seen some media examples in Georgia and in Michigan where the data center did not comply with what those permitted conditions were, and the only recourse the community had was a fine, which is it's like lint in the pocket of this data center developer. It's not very much money. Sure, they'll pay the fine. It's not a problem, but that doesn't solve the resource issue at the local level. So what we wanted, our work is really focused on making sure we give communities the tools to be able to make the decisions that they need to make and be able to enforce them as well.
Yeah.
And that's
Well,
irrespective of size.
thanks, man. And this question kind of will go back to you too. Which is you spoke to that role of local government and state government as something I know folks have been wrestling with here, and we have a number of state legislators on the call with us. What do you see as that balance of kind of what's the role of local government and local control in terms of zoning, economic development, health protection, and kind of the state's role in terms of making sure that, resources that are of interest to the public writ large across the state are protecting human health or other things? Which sits where, do you think?
So the first step is the state sets the rules for how planning and zoning statutes are passed. The state defines what the powers are at the local level to govern their planning and zoning decision making. So the state has a very significant role in giving guidance to those local communities. And you have done that in Oregon. You've got great comprehensive planning requirements that at Lincoln we were very impressed with, because some states don't even require that a comprehensive plan have a water element in it. And so it's good to have that as a good backbone, that you have strong planning statutes that then require the locals to put together plans that are uniform in the level of what they consider and the goals that they all achieve and the results that they are able to achieve as a result of their regulation. So it's an important partnership. The locals have to comply with what the state dictates is state policy, and states have to adopt policies that are respective of the needs of the local communities. So it's a symbiotic relationship, but it's handled differently in 50 different ways across the country. So it's a real question of how Oregon, what you want to do. Do you want to put some of these requirements into state statute, or do you want to empower local communities to make those decisions with specific guidance? And that's a decision for you all to make.
Okay, thanks,
There
Marianne.
are some states that are attempting moratoriums at the state level and strict rules at the state level, and that's running into a lot of political arguments about whether that makes any sense whatsoever. So it's really a decision for legislators and local officials to make together.
Gotcha. I want to circle back to that moratorium question later on, but Emily, I know you have to jump off here in just a second. Did you want to speak to this kind of state role versus local government role before you left? Or any other final thoughts before we let you go?
I can just quickly say, I guess that just what I've learned from the research is that it's really important to have open information sharing, whatever that may mean or whatever form that may take, just to have more informed government decision making and more informed planning at the local level, and just the trickle down effect from state and even a regional body is super important. And yeah, the more information that people can learn, I think the more trust that can be built. So thank you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
Take care. We're really glad you're able to join us. We hope you remain a resource for us as state goes forward.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Bye now.
Bye.
She raised an issue, Bobby, that I'd love to just comment on briefly. It's that
Please.
transparency issue. And that's been one that's been very controversial in states around the country, that often communities are faced with data center applicants that are insisting they sign non-disclosure agreements. So they can't even communicate to their own citizens in the community what the application actually says. So there's a distinct lack of transparency in the energy and water consumption information, because it is deemed proprietary to whatever that particular data center applicant technology is. And so that becomes a real concern. And state of California enacted, the legislature passed, both the House and the Senate passed a requirement that data centers report their annual energy and water use, and then the governor vetoed it. So these are all controversial issues, but without good information, it's hard to make good decisions. So transparency is a key topic.
Yeah, I want to build on that one a little bit. And I see the questions, David, from you on will Oregon expand use of Columbia River water, and Will from you on kind of do good examples of water availability exist. Some of those are age-old questions that I'm not going to ask this group to answer. But that idea of is there additional water for whatever kinds of uses out of the Columbia? Is important, and I don't know that we're going to answer that one. And then I'd turn it back to this group to say if there are some good examples of water availability analysis, that would be amazing things that you could point us as the Water Policy Service to, and we can include those citations and discussion in the memo. We didn't find ones explicitly, but we didn't look that hard for that either. Um,
We're building two, and we've got the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, built a hydrological gap analysis, which is what we called it, for both Virginia and Arizona, and we'll be publishing that. But there might be some material that I can share even before it gets published about how they did that, because it's Will's right. Good examples are hard to find.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, So for both Marianne and for the Water Policy Service folks, I just throughout the course of the last few months of putting this together, trying to sort through the volume of information to get to like the nuance and precision of like a data center uses this much water. Well, is it just the direct water for the cooling, or are you including the indirect water for the water energy nexus? Are you being clear about what the megawatt usage is or the scale and size of it? So it's really hard to get some of those comparables, or like the industry might report out on something called water use efficiency, which is how efficient the center is using, but that may not matter to the salmon in the river who care about whether there's enough water left in the stream, right? Um, so I'm curious, and for the transparency bit, it's like, okay, we can make all information transparent, but what are some of those key pieces of information that policymakers actually need so that we're not requiring collecting a whole bunch of data and information that we don't even know how to use? So I'm just curious from our team, and Marianne, you can speak to this too. Are there nuances in the kinds of information that you all kind of thought it's like, oh, yeah, this was a really interesting issue that we wrestled with as a team.
Well, I'll jump in to kick it off for you.
Perfect.
So the indirect water usage, which you've pointed out that the water that's needed to cool the energy generation swamps the amount of water that's actually cooling the chips. It is a significantly greater amount. But the real question is, where is that water coming from? Is it coming from the same watershed that the data center is located in, where there also water is being withdrawn for chip cooling? With the energy grid being what it is nationally, you could be having that water withdrawal issue in a completely different area of the country, and not even local to where this data center is being sited. So it becomes an irrelevant statistic, which is not very helpful because it's like a huge amount of water. And if it turns out that your power plants that are forming the part of the grid that is going to be uh, powering that data center, if it is local watershed water, then yes, that entire amount of water needs to be computed, and it will be a large amount of water. I mean, sometimes the chip cooling is less than 10% of what the total water usage is of the facility. So it's the indirect water use is a big issue.
And Marianne, are there states that are you point to as like who got their heads wrapped around that indirect water use well?
The indirect water use, the connection between water and energy has never been as adequately discussed nationally as I thought it should have been. So it's not one that people are doing a great example of. But there are some states that California has done some work in this area, but it's not well documented in terms of process and procedures for other people to follow. And it's all very local. Every situation is so different that you have to calculate where that water is coming from, and it has to be done on a watershed basis. When the data center developer says we're going to offset our water use, we're going to be water neutral, and that offset is some other state, that doesn't help you in your siting decision in Oregon.
Yeah. Well, and I think just for our audience, like if we're pulling a lot of our energy for these data centers from Montana or Wyoming, if it's, natural gas or wind or whatever, that makes a big difference on the difference there. And then also because we have the Bonneville power system in pulling off of hydropower makes a big difference. But Trevor, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, Bobby, just to highlight for folks that in the memo we do, might have a section here that kind of speaks to this, and we kind of walk through the metrics of what we've found that are out there in terms of reporting that is going on, with the caveat that increased transparency reporting is a requirement that has been proposed here with a bunch of folks. But just as an example, we mentioned the water use efficiency metric that is fairly common for data centers. It's just an efficiency number. It doesn't tell you how much is consumed. Some companies are reporting total withdrawal and or total consumption, but whether or not that is grouped together as the entire company's withdrawal and water demand, or even pieced out data center by data center, that's not as consistent as well. So even if they say they are reporting withdrawal, it could be an aggregate number that's not divided by the data center, and that's not as helpful for local communities to plan or even to track what water is being used. And maybe as a transition to Bobby, maybe as a transition to Kelsey's question on the chat, there is a newer metric that's out there. There's only a little bit of information on it, but we came across water usage efficiency plus. So this metric attempts to essentially kind of take that efficiency metric that is kind of long-standing, reliable metric, and add in the impact to the local watershed by including local water risks. But again, this would be founded on data sets that are available. So the question I think that um, uh, comes about and would love folks to respond to on the dialogue draft is, yeah, exactly. What does the state need from this data? And even if we do have this new metric that comes out like water usage efficiency plus, how can that be required? And do the data center operators and the local communities have the ability to report on that in a timely manner, whether it was quarterly or monthly or every year? So it really comes down to what the state wants to do with the data. And then you kind of back plan to say, okay, now we want to require this of our operators. So I'll leave it at that, buddy.
Thanks, Trevor. And then kind of going back to, you mentioned Kelsey's question here on really kind of what the land use impacts are of a 1 million square foot facility or 4.6 million square foot industrial campus. Kelsey, some of the feedback we could really use on the memo is, where does Oregon policy kind of cover those questions about removal fill of wetlands or Goal 5 impacts on riparian or other habitat resources, and where might there be gaps? And there's both the gap in, sure, there's a policy, but maybe it's not being implemented the way it needs to be for these kinds of uses, or there's just a full-on gap. So that would be useful. And your note of mentioning Goal 5 and 6, we hear you there. Any examples you can point us to would be much appreciated. Let's see here.
To the issue we brought up about water availability, water rights and water availability. Like if you have water still that's you may have access to under your water right, doesn't necessarily mean that there's that amount of water in the system to be taken. And that's where you start getting a lot of impact, significant impacts on wetlands and riparian areas and fish and other wildlife and habitats. So I think it's a great question. Look forward to your input, Kelsey. Thanks.
And for our team and Marianne, are there other kind of nuances around data center development and operation that you think are really important for Oregon to lean into or kind of get their heads wrapped around before making decisions on policy?
Well, you mentioned the word moratorium earlier, that you wanted to sort of talk a little bit about that. And there are a number of states, 150 moratoriums or more have been enacted at some point or another over the past year or so. And some of them are intended to be very long term, some of them are short term while the community gets its sort of planning ducks in a row. And I think a moratorium is a tool that should be considered only as a temporary amount of time to give you the ability to actually decide what you would like in your community, set the conditions for where you would actually approve or not approve a data center. Because if you just enact a blanket moratorium without any discretionary criteria in it, you likely get sued as illegally for preventing a form of industrial development that had never been indicated in the community that was worth a kind of moratorium prohibition before. So the state of Maine passed a moratorium in their legislature, and the governor vetoed that too. And the reason she vetoed it is she wants to work on getting a data center cited as a remediation on a brownfield project. So the data center would pay to remediate the brownfield and locate it in an area where those resources, water and energy, were available. And she didn't want to preclude that kind of opportunity for being there, even though many communities didn't seem to want it. So I think the big problem we've got here is that there's a lot of fear and anger about data centers that may or may not be justified depending upon the local situation. But we have to give ourselves time to look at it and think about it. And so what we're proposing at Lincoln, and what we'll be putting in our document, is we're proposing that every community, conduct a stakeholder discussion process within their community so they decide what are the terms and conditions for sustainably siting a data center and sustainably giving the community benefits that would make it worthwhile. And that's just a conversation that has to happen early and not later. You don't wait till the data center applicant comes to town. You need to have that conversation now.
Yeah, thank you for that, Marianne. Jamie?
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, I think one of the nuances, and Marianne, you just kind of got at this, and you got at it earlier too, that intersection between the water and energy and water and land use, right? What are the opportunities? What's been studied? What's been documented? And it kind of comes to a head in one of our areas that we focused on, and it's anticipating those future uses, right? Really understanding, okay, do we have a really well dialed in estimate of future human consumption of water use? Do we have the water rights to allow for that? Now, if we add this data center that we're assuming is going to be air cooled, but maybe that changes in the future. Those are some of those nuances that I think are really challenging, and we'd love to hear some insights and additional recommendations, or if there's some good examples out there of where communities have really thought comprehensively about the future before they do something like this.
Some communities have required air cooling, and then they find that the chip evolution is requiring liquid cooling now. The tower density in the chips is advancing to the point where air cooling is not going to be possible. Within the next 4 or 5 years, I think it'll be gone. It'll be liquid cooling only of various cooling types, whether open loop or closed loop or recycled water or potable water. Air cooling, and that exists in a lot of data centers now. And so the real question is, will that be maintained? And what happens to a local community that conditioned the applicant on doing air cooling because they didn't want water usage, and now the chips have evolved beyond the point where air cooling will even work? What happens then? And so I think it's not just the new data centers coming in, it's the ones we currently have that might be morphing into the next generation of facility. And does the community have the ability to still, be in control there if they've already pre-permitted it back in the day when those impacts were much less?
Mm-hmm. And Marianne, to again at that point, Matt Martinson in a comment here kind of raises that, whether you're a small town or a big city, utilities have kind of a mode of doing their facilities planning. Some have more capacity than others, right? If you're a small town where your clerk is the public works director, is your finance director, is your city manager, you may not have the same capacity as a bigger city with a full department of experts, right? But there are ways of going about doing that. And so providing the assurances that those cities have the capacity to do the advanced planning and kind of look at how to do the systems so that they don't end up in a bind, right? Is part of this, yeah?
That's an interesting question because utility planners typically have not plan their facilities based on looking at land use plans. That's the disconnect that Lincoln is trying to focus on now. There's not a strong connection between land use planning done at the local level and utility planning, usually done at the more regional level. And so sometimes those facility plans are not geared toward the kind of growth that might come from something like a data center being sited. And so the utility might be caught off guard. They might think, oh, this is going to be a terrific revenue generator for us because we have this excess capacity that we can use. But then they don't realize that that excess capacity is now gone and now they're in a deficit. So the favorite story I love to tell is Thames Water in London. I mean, we don't tend to think of London as a particularly dry desert, but the data center, their peak use during their peak periods in London ended up resulting in they basically didn't have enough supply and they had to cut everybody back by a percentage because they couldn't supply both the data center and the resident population, both industrial and commercial and residential users. So utility planning has never been geared to this kind of thing. So everybody's in a brand new spot. And it requires a real analysis that some of the utility folks have not done before, whether they're large or they're small. But when they're small, they really don't have the resources. You're absolutely right.
Well, I guess that's kind of the follow up with that. How much of it is an issue of just making sure utilities and local governments have the capacity they need to get their comp plans and other things updated versus how much new authority do they need from the state to do those kinds of things, or their own city councils for that matter?
One of the things that we've been looking into is in each of the 50 states, where's the requirement that utility and the land use planning authority communicate with each other and coordinate with each other. And it isn't uniformly good across the United States. It's actually quite poor. I mean, there are only something like 13 or 14 states that actually require that the comprehensive plan even address water at all. And that's a concern. And that's something completely separate from the data center issue, but it ties into it very well. It's an example. Data center becomes the big example of a dysfunction that we didn't really notice much before.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions that folks have?
Bobby, I just wanted a quick add on to your question about nuance and operations, and then Marianne kind of said something that perked my ears up is peak demand. So a lot of the numbers that you see when when a data center is being sited, whether it's power or water, peak demand we're finding is just crucial. So the example that I gave earlier about the Prineville data center, they can use free cooling for most of the year given the climate, the high desert climate. It's only during those hot summer months, those summer days, where the direct evaporative cooling kind of kicks in. And so if you're, if you're kind of planning off of a per day water use as a community, that doesn't get down to the granularity of a peak demand usage in the summer versus it's not much of an issue in the winter. So I just wanted to highlight peak demand.
Thanks, Trevor. And I think that was one of the things for our learning over the last couple months is like the more we can be precise about direct and indirect use, peak use or total annual use, and what's falling outside of what our existing policy structures can handle really well, or what falls within it. We just need to make sure we're paying attention to our existing policies and it's got adequate capacity to do what they're designed to do, are all things that we wrestled with. So I think with that, Marianne, unless you have kind of closing thoughts, I'm going to start winding us down and kind of encouraging folks to get us some feedback. But any other closing thoughts you have for us or encouragements?
Well, I'm thinking as I'm hearing this peak demand discussion that the irony is your peak demand goes up when it gets drier, when the hydrology is at its worst because you're in a more or less of a drought. That's when your peak demand in a utility system is highest. And that's direct conflict with what would be going on with a data center, which has constant draw. So yeah, knowing what your system can do, we've spent too many years in water resources planning just looking at average day demand, and that's not the answer anymore. It's the peak. The peak is what we have to build to, and so that's what you have to look at in evaluating whether you can supply a data center that has constant 24/7 use. What Trevor described, I find very unusual. We don't see a lot of data centers that operate like that. It's just pretty constant draw. So we all have a
Closing.
lot of work to do.
Yeah, we do, and we thank you for helping us do some. Peter, Allison, Trevor, Jamie, any other kind of closing thoughts from you all?
Well, excuse me, I'll post one to Marianne. Marianne, if folks want to stay in the loop about when your material is published, what's the best way for them to do that?
When I send out the PowerPoint that I promised to, I'll send out a link where they can sign up for the Lincoln email newsletter, which will inform everybody when the work comes out. So I'll send that out too,
Great.
and you can forward it.
I appreciate your discussion of how changing technology could lead a data center to become all of a sudden obsolete. And it's, kind of boggles a regular person's mind to think that a company would walk away from a facility, but that's exactly what they would do if in fact all of a sudden it's cheaper to build a new one somewhere else than to retool an existing one. Kind of makes it more important to think about those decommissioning bonds. And it helps me to understand a little bit, behind the moratoriums, people are afraid of that kind of thing, even if it's not the right thing to be afraid of. It's fueling some pretty tough sentiments. Um, I remember you had a map that showed Oregon and Washington. Well, it looked at like new data centers proposed for Oregon. And I was wondering, is there a difference? And I mean, don't feel like you have to answer this if you don't know. Is there a difference between either side of that river in terms of data center development, Washington versus Oregon?
No, I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question, but I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, we always are looking for natural experiments, and that could be an interesting one.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, though.
And Troy, I see your comment in here too on kind of the importance of comprehensive plans happening prior to construction. There's a number of state policies in the memo we point to that are asking for that. So like Minnesota is an example where information needs to come in prior to permitting construction of a large data center. Um, One of the things that we're pointing to is both having the requirement to get information, but then also making sure there's enough information to evaluate that. So, for example, you mentioned water availability, or some of Oregon's water availability information is not complete and or outdated or never was complete. So there's having enough information available and then to be able to evaluate it prior to construction. So we point to some of those, but I would encourage you to take a look at those sections of the memo, and if there's areas that we can be more precise and or point to other examples or policy options, we'd love to see those. And um, yeah, so I think, oh yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Very quickly, I'm sorry. One thing that we don't talk much about, the time horizon here, 10, 20, 30 years. And if we are in fact looking at long-term drought, to what extent are these companies factoring that into their planning? To what extent are counties factoring that into their permitting? Any idea? Should we be worried more about that or not? Thank you. Yeah.
It's a significant issue.
Are people looking at it, do you know? Are they trying to?
You mean with respect to data centers?
Yeah, say the planners of the data center, are they projecting future water availability?
Well, the irony of this whole thing is that 40% of the world's data centers are located in water scarce areas. So they must be, or else they would not be able to justify building a data center in an area that's already experiencing scarcity that's only bound to increase. With climate change, we know that the drier areas get drier and the wetter areas get wetter. Um, so that's a significant concern, and whether they're building it into long-term projections is not clear to me.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Thank you. Well, everybody, thank you so much for coming together today. Again, as a reminder, we would really love feedback on the dialogue draft by May 22nd. We realize that's not very far away, but getting that feedback from you by the 22nd lets us incorporate edits and turn around a new version that can be available for the Data Center Advisory Committee and all of you, as Oregon is kind of thinking of deliberations on next steps. In particular, the kinds of feedback that's most useful: where were we wrong? Two, are there examples that we missed? Three, if you have a question in your mind that we don't speak to, so basically a broader issue area, how might we incorporate that, or is there some additional research we could do pretty quickly to bring that issue up and frame some options and considerations around it? So that's the homework for all of you. We look forward to seeing you again, and thank you for joining us. Marianne, special thanks to you and to Emily for taking time out of your day. And then also part of what linked us in with Marianne and Emily were our friends at the National Conference of State Legislatures, the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, kind of the Western States water groups. So there's a lot of folks actively talking about this who are trying to create a bit of a network on folks working on this issue. So hopefully we get to stay in touch too. And if we can ever be helpful to you, let us know. But take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Yes, thank you.